This week I mostly just worked on small improvements. I've massively improved the way shadows look and work, I improved a few of the effects in the overworld like the wind effect, and I spent an entire day trying to figure out why lighting was wrong for voxel meshes. I haven't figured that one out yet. This is a game about exploration and discovery in a procedurally generated high fantasy world. It's kind of trying to distill that feeling of discovering things in a game like Skyrim into a gameplay loop that would fit quite well onto a mobile device. That's the plan. So I kind of just got to make sure it's all polished up and ready to go. And also my Blender animation tool now works, so I'm glad that's now been formally shot in the head. So the shadows in the game kind of had been weird for a long time. They often just looked wrong, were low resolution, or caused this annoying flashing effect which slowly drove me mad. The solution that I ended up finding was to dynamically set the distance for which the shadow should render with a proper API function. Remember, this is a game made with my own engine, but it's also based on top of Ogre 3D for graphics. So I pretty much just had to find the right function call to make it work. I just didn't know what that function was because the documentation it's not great. This is where AI is really great though, because it just knows these things, or at least can point me in the right direction. So I dynamically set the distance for shadows to render based on zoom level, meaning when you're more zoomed in, the shadows are much crisper. I also rewrote my cloud system because you can actually see the shadows now. Before they just kind of popped in, which was a little bit nasty. I've also fixed shadows for water and undiscovered regions because turns out shadows were just disabled for these compositing steps. Oops. I'm also having to deal with this problem called Peter Panning, which, I mean, that is actually what it's called. And it's essentially a problem where the shadow is like slightly detached from the object, just like in the actual story. Oh, it's almost like they named something that made sense. I've managed to get around this by tweaking some values, but this is just one of those things that's kind of always a problem, and you just have to get the numbers in balance for the specific scene. So next thing, I've made some improvements to the wind effect. On devices like the Steam Deck, wind at a distance just looked kind of really grainy and just sort of generally terrible. I now take distance into account when rendering wind, so I can taper it off if it's a long way away. The effect does look way better now when rendered at a lower resolution, and we've got no more grain. I've made a number of huge improvements in the code base. Probably the most important was I've got a workaround for a construction issue relating to voxel meshes. Previously, due to the way the classes actually worked, which was built on top of what Ogre already had, it used to do a lot of redundant checks for shader pieces, as initialize would essentially set up and then I just end up replacing all this stuff. This also meant I used to get a lot of unnecessary error messages. I found a way to reorganize this without modifying Ogre's code, and things are just much more reliable now. This also fixed an issue I had where the tree vertex shader animations just weren't being applied ever. It had just totally regressed. I also cleaned up the status affliction code so multiple status afflictions can be present. I made entity components look up faster by using a hash table, which turns out was a massive speed up. I fixed this regression with visited places terrain, which is painful to look at, and I ensured status afflictions can be applied properly to the player. And I spent ages trying to figure out why the lighting was not correct for a scene like this. Actually, I haven't solved this one yet. It just kind of drove me crazy, but essentially I store normal values in the shader itself because there's only 6 possible values, so I can reduce my vertice size by quite a bit. But for some reason, when I rotate these meshes, the normals are not transformed as I expect them to be, so the lighting just ends up being completely wrong. I spent ages going through number tables on the GPU frame captures trying to sort this out, but I ran out of time yesterday, so I'll have to come back to it next week. In other news though, the Blender animation tool is now working, and I can export animations back to the engine XML format. The only thing that doesn't work is the animation curves that Blender has, as the engine doesn't actually know how to do those. For now I'm just going to ignore it, but it is nice to see the tool actually working. So that's it for this week. Next week is probably going to be a bit more of technical stuff. Apologies, I was very hungover today, especially during the recording, so I hope my voice doesn't sound a bit weird, because there might have been some shouting going on yesterday. Who can tell? But yeah, I think the main thing I want to get back to is working on the world gen, I think, because it's starting to kind of show its decrepitude, and I'm not very happy. It just kind of like affects how the gameplay works. So yeah, I'm thinking I'm going to get back to that. I've done a bit of combat, so yeah, time to move off combat. Hope you have a good week. Bye.